Senator Paul, it's great to see you here on the Cain Podcast. I want to start talking with you about Ukraine. Tell me about where we stand on the spending package, the $40 billion sent to or set to be sent to Ukraine, and your objection to that spending package.
It's going to go out the door this morning. This will be a total now of $60 billion that we've given to Ukraine. It's approximately equal to what Russia spends in 1 year. And they're already telling us that it'll last till September and we'll be asked to do this again. The country of Ukraine is destroyed, so in all likelihood, they're going to ask us to rebuild Ukraine as well. And I'm not unsympathetic. I have a great deal of sympathy for them. I want them to win. I want them to push the Russians out. In fact, I think the Russians have been so malignant in their invasion that I think the Ukrainians aren't going to stop shooting them until the last Russian's gone. So I think this really is a big miscalculation. But from our point of view, if we honestly believe this is in our national security interest, we could ask the American people to pay for this. And one way to do it, we've done the math on this, would be to ask every taxpayer who pays income tax in our country to give $500. If they all put $500 in a new tax, a war tax for Ukraine, you'd pay for this. But I think also you'd find Americans are somewhat fickle. They are fine to sort of put it on the tab as long as they don't feel the pain or see the pain. But if you ask every American to pay $500, my guess is it might not be as popular. So that's kind of where we are. I think borrowing it adds to inflation and adds to our burden of debt. That's why I've been opposed to it.
Yeah, let's dig in a little bit as to why you've been opposed to it. I appreciate the comparison. Numbers and zeros, I think, become abstract at some point, as you point out. I believe, by the way, it's bigger than the Russian military budget. The amount that we are dedicating to Ukraine, I believe, would build the 10th largest army in the world, bigger than South Korea. I believe if these comparisons are accurate, 3 times the cost of the proposed border wall under the Trump administration. What is the argument for the American interest here in spending this kind of money? I understand the empathy. I understand the humanitarian cause. But when it comes to our money, our dollars, and the American interest, what is the argument?
I think the argument, and it needs to be an argument or a debate, is what is in our national security interest. And you hear this a lot of times when you have a foreign policy debate. People will say, well, this is clearly in Americans' national security interest, or it's a vital national security interest. To me, that's the beginning of the debate, or that's the end of the debate. That's the conclusion. So you and I could debate whether it is, in national security. I'll present facts, you present facts, and then people will figure out from the presentation whether it is or isn't. But I think most of the time in Washington, people just make a conclusion. It is in our national security interest. I think you have to weigh our domestic interest versus our international interest. I think domestically we do have problems that we face. The main problem, I think, and I agree with Admiral Mullen from several years ago, is that our national security is most threatened by debt. I also think our border crisis on our southern border is a big problem for us as well. And so I think I put that in perspective with it. But even for that, I'm not for borrowing more money even for the southern border. I'm for security on the southern border. I'd take it from somewhere in the budget. I'm hardcore. I don't want to add more debt. Even with our budget as it is, we add about $1 trillion paying for Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, Social Security, and the military, and some more welfare programs. Those big programs add up to $1 trillion more leaving the Treasury than coming in. And that's causing problems. I don't want to be Venezuela. I don't want to be a country where the once mighty dollar and the once mighty country we had is destroyed by destroying our currency.
Yeah, and I think the American people are probably seeing the effects of that. They're definitely seeing it. The question is, are they connecting the dots when we're experiencing this inflation right now because of the readiness and willingness to spend and print money? So I'm curious, Senator, I know you are an adherent to the Constitution. It seemed to me there was a time when the United States of America voted by an act of Congress on whether or not to be involved in a war. Now, I guess that brings into the question, are we at war? What is the definition of being at war? But to your point a moment ago about putting it to the American people, we don't do that anymore, it seems.
Right. And some of these are tough calls. So, for example, during the Cold War, the Russians invaded Hungary in the 50s, Czechoslovakia in the 60s. And there were many who said, by golly, we should stand up to the communists and we should fight them in Hungary and fight them in Czechoslovakia. And we didn't, but we did them because we weighed on balance what was the possible ramifications of nuclear war with Russia. And it doesn't mean we were afraid of Russia, but we have to make these calculations back and forth on what we do. But I will say this. Often I've been a critic of our foreign policy. I think it's really important to be a critic right now of Russia's foreign policy. Russia's foreign policy is completely failing. Everything they have done has gone wrong for them. They're mired in this battle. Ukraine, I think, has at least come, maybe if not to an upper hand, but to a very ferocious resistance that's not going away anytime soon. Sweden and Finland for hundreds of years have been neutral and not wanting to get involved with a major alliance like NATO, or in all likelihood going to be part of NATO. I also think that Crimea was unlikely to go from Russia. I probably said it a year or two ago. There's no way Crimea is ever going back to Ukraine. Now I think it's 50-50 or better that the Ukrainians will not quit fighting till they get all of Ukraine back. And here's the thing. A resistance that involves people so mad because you've killed their wives and their grandmothers and bombed hospitals, it doesn't go away. And you can shoot somebody, as you know, from 1,500 yards. So Russians are going to be dying for a long time in Ukraine, and there's going to be, look, they had trouble beating Afghanistan. How do you think they're going to do in Ukraine? So I think the Russians will ultimately rue the day that they did this. And I think we don't have to be overwhelmed thinking the Ukrainians are going to lose. Right now, I think the Ukrainians have fought this to a standstill.
Okay, well, that's a great transition going back to what serves the American interest. So I'm going to now give voice to, I think, perhaps, if not your critics, then at least those who would stand on the other side of the issue from you on this. I believe it's Congressman Dan Crenshaw of Texas who's pointed this out. As you point out, Russia doesn't seem to be doing well in Ukraine. Their foreign policy seems to be failing across Eastern Europe. It is in the American national interest to weaken one of our foreign policy adversaries. I think that's a fair characterization of Russia without going the full definition of perhaps our enemy, a foreign policy adversary. And Crenshaw's argument, I believe, if I'm being fair to him, would be bleed them out. We are pushing them into another Afghanistan. We are pushing them into certain defeat without ever sacrificing an American soldier, and that serves the American interest.
And I think if the conclusion of the war is that they're either chastened or Putin leaves power and his prediction is true, then it will have been good advice. If the conclusion, though, is something else unexpected, that he gets pushed into a box and launches a nuclear weapon either into Kiev or into Europe, into a European capital or into the United States, because somehow we've pinned him down and he's being humiliated in his country and we go too far. So, and nobody knows that. That's the future. It's sort of like at the end of World War I, did we know that maybe that we had gone too far in punishing Russia? Punishing Germany at the end of World War I, and that many people now say that World War II in many ways was a response to maybe too harsh of reparations and payments after World War I. Because people are talking about that now. The Ukrainian foreign minister said that the goal now is to have them pushed out of all of Ukraine, and the goal is to have reparations. So if we fight on till that, are we going to give them $40 billion, or can we afford to give them $40 billion every 6 months?
But I heard what you just had to say then. Even though you have concerns about the amount of spending, and I've seen you also make objections about where's the oversight, where's the inspector general on all of this spending, even though you have those concerns about spending, if the conclusion of all of this spending in this war is that there is regime change in Russia, then you would agree with Crenshaw. If you could accomplish regime change, it'd be worth the, right now, what do you say we are, $60 billion, it will climb from there, but it would be worth it if it resulted in regime change?
No, I think I would argue that it's uncertain what's going to happen, so you have to be aware of other possibilities. I think in retrospect, you could look back. If we keep giving them $40 billion and all of a sudden we get a democracy in Russia and a pro-Western country, really, which is what we thought we had, when the Iron Curtain fell, when the Soviet Union fell apart. If you knew that for certain, my point is that you don't know for certain. There is also some possibility of a nuclear war. Now, we all hope that doesn't happen. But is there a point at which you humiliate your enemy to a point? Many people who look at war realize the messiness of war, and that as we as a war ends, there needs to be an exit ramp. And people talk about saving face, even in diplomacy or among your enemies, that at the very end, you don't want to make them kiss your shoes. What you want to do is make them feel as if they have not lost as badly as they actually lost. And see, even Zelensky is, I think, more realistic on this than sometimes U.S. politicians. U.S. politicians are the most jingoistic, unthinking people you'll ever meet. Many of them haven't fought. Now, Dan Crenshaw has fought, so I give him credit for having been there. But many of them aren't thinking really of the consequences of this. And so we do need to be thinking. And Zelensky has actually said that one possibility might be the neutrality of Ukraine. And that's why I go back even farther than this. We've been talking about Ukraine being in NATO, and I think provocatively so for a long time. Biden made an agreement and reinforced an agreement last fall to say, wow, yes, we want them in NATO. And yet most people still didn't think they were going to be part of NATO. But that agitation didn't help the situation. And there is a possible scenario, looking backwards in history, that had we not been so provocative with that there might not have been an invasion. Now, the other side argues, no, Putin doesn't care. Putin was going to invade no matter what happened with NATO. But there have been many smart people who have warned about this. George Kennan, one of the most famous diplomats of the last century, warned about it. Jack Matlock, famous ambassador under the first George Bush to Russia, warned about it. And so we do need to be aware of it. But Zelensky's still saying that neutrality might be. And you could see how one offer of peace, let's say they're pushing the Russians back and they push the Russians out of the country, but there still has to be some sort of peace that will come from that. One sort of offer of peace at that point when the Ukrainians are feeling more safe would be, you know what, why don't we be a conduit, as Kissinger said, 1 foot in the east and 1 foot in the west, and we'll be a conduit between east and west, but we're not going to be in a military alliance with either. I think that might be a way of bringing a more stable situation, because you have to realize, see, that Putin's not alone, and Putin isn't the only sort of nationalist in Russia. And I'll tell you something that I found disturbing. I visited Gorbachev a couple years ago, and it was one of the most amazing conversations I've ever had. But at that time, there was a poll done in Russia, and more people appreciated Stalin than Gorbachev in Russia. And that's something we just need to be aware of. So if Putin were to leave, I think there's a great deal of nationalism in Russia that it doesn't mean we agree with it, but diplomacy and foreign policy means understanding your enemies, but not sort of ignoring what they say. And
you're acknowledging the uncertainty. So if I hear you correctly, if you were certain for a positive regime change, the spending might be worth it. But we have to acknowledge, A, we don't know what comes after Putin. And B, what does someone do when put into a corner, when faced with an act of desperation? And that leads you to the second alternative, which I hear you making a balancing act. We're going to compromise our own national interest with the spending with these potential outcomes. And one of the potential outcomes is a nuclear war, or at least a nuclear bomb being detonated. Right. In your estimation, Senator, and I understand it's an uncertainty, what is going on that gamble? I mean, do you think we are sleepwalking ourselves towards that potentiality?
I don't think there's enough attention being paid to alternative scenarios where this gets worse. Someone needs to think it through, and I know in the military they think through every sort of possible iteration of what might happen. But I don't think it is. And if it were, part of the question is, what would I have done if I had my druthers? I would have sold them arms, and I would have loaned them money. And I just think that's the more fiscally prudent way of doing this, as opposed to gifts. The other thing is as much as, look, I'm influenced by seeing the heroic nature of Zelensky standing up to the big aggressor, this big country, Russia, that is the aggressor. So I'm impressed and sympathetic to that. But we also have to put in perspective that when you study corruption, Ukraine has been in the top 10 countries for corruption for decades. Mm-hmm. We have to remember that many on the Republican side were talking about corruption with Burisma, an oligarch, and Ukrainians have oligarchs that were giving money to Hunter Biden. And so we just have to be aware, and there should have been oversight. So what my proposal this week was actually to have the Special Inspector General, which is someone who oversees money right now for Afghanistan, and then that job is waning now, to have him take over Ukraine. He could hit the ground running. He has a team of people. They're used to looking at expenditures in foreign countries in the time of war. He would have been perfect. But the fact that they rejected that, both Republicans and Democrats rejected that, means that they care more just about shoveling the money out, and they just really don't care about the American taxpayer.
Okay, last question for you. And I hear you through this conversation. And look, I've said this as well, and it's not just a checking the box exercise. Russia needs to be condemned on the international stage. They are obviously the aggressor, but the question is what serves the American people when talking about our own involvement? What serves the American interest? What do you make of the fact that every time you seem to introduce any of that conversation or any of those questions, you're met with, and not just you, the proverbial you're met with, you're being Putin's puppet. This is for global democracy, the global rule of law, fall back on something to do with liberty. And it's not, you brought up jingoistic politicians. Honestly, it's the oddest thing. It's not just from traditional neoconservative rhetoric. It's the left, and it includes now the far left. What's going on?
Well, I think that it is amazing how unified and how sort of the blob of Washington, the swamp, really is so unified, Republican and Democrat, and they don't want any dissent. But I think that's when dissent is even more important. And so I don't mind being a minority of one. I'd rather be a bigger minority. But in this case, we were a minority of 11 Republicans who voted against this. But I had an interaction with Blinken in a committee. And I began my statement by saying, while there is no justification for Putin's invasion of Ukraine, we should still look for an explanation because, like, for World War II, no one justifies Hitler or thinks Hitler was good, but we still look for the causes of World War II, and one of them was the harshness of reparations after World War I. But if you don't look for those causes because you're declared unpatriotic, it's sort of the danger of what's also we're talking about in disinformation and censorship on the internet. A free society really needs dissent. I'm not saying I'm always right. I'm just saying it's important to have someone who voices dissent so people can decide. And that's a dangerous time when we get rid of dissent in our country.
All right, Senator Rand Paul, I would love to talk to you again. I'd love to talk to you about disinformation, the future of the Disinformation Governance Board. I'd love to talk to you about Dr. Anthony Fauci. But today I thought this was the most important thing we dig a little bit deeper on. I appreciate your stand, and I appreciate you sharing it with us this morning.
Thank you.